yes, by the time we're done working together, you have a great wardrobe and you look aesthetically good. But even more importantly is as we go through the process, we uncover what your identity is and what your aspirational identity is, because that's what you really have to work with in order to create good, congruent, effective style. And so do you want to communicate things like credibility, authority, trustworthiness? Is it openness and friendliness and affability? Is it all of those things? And what does that look like for you guys being in the part of the world that you are and working in the industries in which you work and having the family relationships that you have? It's very different than it is for me with my components. And so you have to have a really integrated understanding of who you are, what your moral background and backbone are, how that gets translated over into other people, and then how you can use your clothing to express it to them and reinforce it in yourself.
My name's Paul. I'm the founder of Manifesto, and this is a conversation with Tanner Guzy, the host and founder of MasculineStyle.com and the author of The Appearance of Power, which is a guide to masculine clothing and style. And I got to say, I found this to be probably the most interesting conversation that I've had so far on this podcast. It is a subject that I am not an expert on at all. I'm definitely a part of that generation that Tanner refers to in the beginning of this conversation, who kind of saw like, oh yeah, like getting into clothes and stuff, that's this like kind of metrosexual, non-masculine way of using your time and energy. So I kind of pride myself in like, I don't use, skincare products. I don't use hair care products. I just like cut my own hair and I don't think too much about my clothing either. But this conversation with Tanner really got me to reconsider that last perspective in a very deep way. And I think Tanner really takes, these very basic everyday questions about what you're wearing, and he manages to lift it up at a level which makes it incredibly interesting to consider your own relationship to it, at the same time keeping it connected to just like normal practical sensibilities. So yeah, I really enjoyed this talk with Tanner, and highly recommend checking out his work as well. But for now, here's the conversation. So Tanner, welcome to Manifesto's Friday community meeting.
Thanks, Paul. I'm excited to be here, man.
Yeah, good to have you on. So yeah, you are an expert in an area where I am certainly no expert at all, in that of clothing. And I guess, when I first started considering this, what do I really think about this and how am I going to work with this whole idea of masculine style? Because that's what you're an expert in. As far as I can see, pretty much the leading expert in the world. And you've done TED Talks on this, and have a really good, interesting website, which really provoked me to think a lot about. I just read an article about symbolism and functionality in masculine style. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And so this kind of play between superficiality and depth and reestablishing, refining or rediscovering what it means to be a man in a society today where a lot of, there's a lot of different approaches or different opinions on this kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm looking forward to a chat here. And I actually thought I read the intro of your book, The Appearance of Power. And I thought I want to read up a little section from that, because I think it really just puts this whole question right on, opens it up in a really good way.
Okay, let's do it.
So yeah, you speak about your uncle, who's kind of like this guy who lives in this tiny little town, really like a falconer and quite a loner guy, and you helped him to buy a suit and helped him to kind of feel more at home in himself, I guess, coming to a funeral. And then he had this book with old pictures, and this is what I'm going to read from about now. So this is from your book. I started to thumb through the book and was quickly drawn in by the clothing of the men. Some photos were from the 19th century, others were during World War II, and there were even some from the early 21st century. As I was looking at a particular page of war veterans returning home in their uniforms in the 1940s, I made the comment of how much I loved the discipline, honor, and diligence that these men exemplified and was demonstrating through their uniforms. The clothes were neatly pressed, well fit, and made them look like dignified war heroes. My uncle chuckled wryly and said, those uniforms hid their lack of those virtues as often as they projected them.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, you're engaged in you know, you're talking about masculine style a lot, but you're also engaged in this idea of like, what does it mean to be a man, and how do we come back to a more deep or authentic or classical strong masculinity? So how do you work with making sure that masculine style isn't just a superficial kind of way of faking our way to something instead of actually doing the deep work? That's my core question that I feel.
That's the best core question, because that's kind of the root of all of it. So much of a modern man's antipathy for style is because we're kind of caught in this idea that it is all superficial, or that there is this disparity between how men present themselves on the outside and who they are on the inside. And sadly, it's because there are a lot of examples of that. And so what I do is I start the opposite way. Most guys who do what I do, whether it's guys with YouTube channels or that are stylists or that run blogs, they will start on an external focus, which is, what are the trends that are happening right now? Or what is this particular company paying me to, you know, do sponsored content for, or something else? And it's all externally driven. Whereas my approach is, you have to start with who you currently are on the inside and who it is that you're trying to build yourself into becoming, and then use your clothing as a way to manifest that out into the world. Not only so that you reinforce that in your own head, so that you see congruence between who I am on the inside and who I am on the outside, that there's no dissonance or disparity between the two of them, but also so that that's what's presented to other people, so that they see more integrity, they see more congruence, they see more true authenticity, they see more aspiration, because they may get an initial first impression of you. And then when that aligns with what you actually are, their respect for you goes up, their trust for you goes up, everything amplifies in a good way when they see that you are who you present yourself to be. So you got to start on the inside and work your way out, as opposed to starting on the outside to create an identity on the inside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you kind of hinted at like there's quite a lot of resistance, I guess, especially maybe in previous generations, towards just talking about style at all, right? Like, what do you find is like the barriers to this kind of thing in men, or how do you address that?
So we're in kind of a weird cultural anomaly, in that prior to the baby boomers, there wasn't this aversion to talking about style. It was a very common thing, and men cared about it. And you go to any culture at any point in time, anywhere in the world, and men have always used their clothing as a way to signal things like Jack Donovan talks about: strength, courage, mastery, honor. I mean, you go and you find the most remote, small, completely isolated tribe. A lot of times they don't even need clothing from a functional perspective. They're not wearing shoes. They don't need to be protected from the elements, but they wear clothing because of the symbolic representation that's in there, what it signals to the other men in the group. And so it's deeply baked into us to care about our appearance. But my theory on this is that when you get to the baby boom generation and their complete resistance and resentment of everything that was their parents' generation or prior generations, part of what got thrown out with all of that resentment was also the idea that men care about how they look. And they moved into this very kind of like lone wolf idea of, in order to be a real man, I shouldn't care what anybody thinks of me. And one of the easiest ways to prove that I don't care what anybody thinks of me, which is, you know, ironic because you're proving to people that anyway, but is that I'm just going to dress in a way that looks like I don't care how they look. And that became very embraced, where for me, being an older millennial, being kind of in between the Gen X and the millennial generation, that was a culture that I was raised in. That was a culture that Gen X was raised in. That was a culture that a lot of millennials were raised in. And so it was anti-masculine, it was vain, it was immoral, it was gay and effeminate, like whatever thing you could throw against it to make it bad for the average man, whatever subculture would throw against it, so that you develop this real aversion to caring about your appearance.
Yeah, because I kind of feel like I almost grew up with either, you know, there's this metrosexual kind of modern, very effeminate man who cares about his style, or it's just like the guy who like does whatever, doesn't care, right, or something like that. And
exactly,
it's like there was never a middle way. Actually, that's fascinating. I would have never thought that was something that came with the baby boomers, but that makes a lot of sense as well, actually, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you spoke about functional clothing and symbolic clothing in this article, and you refer to it now as well a little bit, with like how even in tribal cultures, like clothing had a very strong symbolic message that it carried. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean about those two categories and then where we're standing today?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, clothing is rooted in function. It's protection of your body. It's the ability to get particular jobs done. And again, for a lot of men, that's really kind of the only place that we give ourselves permission to care about what we buy or what we wear is, does it somehow increase functionality? For a lot of us, white collar, office workers in the suburbs, in an urban environment, we actually don't even need our clothing to do much functionally. And so this is where you get trapped in this idea of, is it comfortable? And that's really kind of the supreme function that guys care about. But again, you zoom out a little bit and you take a look at an historical and a cultural lens, and you come to realize that clothing is just as expressive of a form of communication as the written and the spoken word, where you can use things like an example that I gave in my TED Talk was you had to be a citizen of Rome, not just like a resident in the Roman Empire, but a citizen of Rome in order to be able to wear a toga. And depending on what your status was, like if you were a magistrate or if you fulfilled different like bureaucratic opportunities, then you were able to wear different colored fringes on your togas. And so it was an immediate way for people to be able to recognize that this is somebody that we can go to. And we do the same thing now, where how do you know somebody's a police officer? It's based on their uniform, right? Or it's based on the uniform of the car that they're driving. And so it's a much more effective and quick way of being able to communicate authority, to be able to communicate power, to be able to communicate danger, depending on how your perspective is of police officers. But all of that you get in a snap instant just because of what it is that they're wearing. Mm-hmm. And healthy cultures create entire languages in clothing. Mm-hmm. And what unhealthy cultures do, and we see this in both the written and the spoken language, and we certainly see this in aesthetic language, is they degenerate everything down to this nebulousness where nothing means anything. And sadly, that's what we've seen in the West for the last 60 years, is we've seen the degeneration of our aesthetic language. And now we're starting to see the degeneration of our written and our spoken language. And those are very closely tied together.
Yeah. And yeah, it's really true. I mean, so what my approach to clothing has been like, I bought a whole box of black manifesto t-shirts not so long ago, mm-hmm. just plain black normal one with a little black manifesto logo on the black material, so you could hardly see it, right? And that's what I wear every single day, because it's been the simplest and easiest thing, and I actually feel very comfortable in that as well, and it makes sense for me. It's become like my uniform, but mm-hmm. it's just like the last vestiges of kind of holding on to like some kind of symbolism or some kind of things where I see, like, you know, and if you look for like a lot of male fashion advice, and I imagine that in your work as well, that like it's about being nondescript. Your clothing is kind of like just the background, and you want it to be as, unless you're specifically trying to make a statement, then most of the time you just want it to be fitting in, right?
Right. Yeah, what most guys try to do is they don't want to lose, so they play to avoid losing as opposed to playing to win. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference there. And even when you talk about this idea of comfort, what most of us say when we think we want to be comfortable is, I want physical comfort. But really, I mean, if that's what you're after, then wear a bathrobe all day. You know, like that's comfortable, right? Mm-hmm. What you really want, but you know you're not going to do that. Like, we can all chuckle at that because you know that comes with social consequences, that comes with self-perception consequences, right? Mm-hmm. And so really what we're saying when we want to be comfortable is, I want the comfort of that, of blending in, of having no negative perspectives on me, but also no positive expectations of me. So I want the comfort of neutrality. I want the comfort of ease. I want the comfort of no expectations. I want the comfort of no pressure. Mm-hmm. And I don't know of any culture that values masculinity, or the guy that's the most masculine is the one who seeks the least amount of pressure, or who wants the lowest level of expectations on him. That's never been a barometer for masculinity.
Yeah, unfortunately, some people are trying to push that upwards, right? But certainly, yeah, there's a. Yeah, it doesn't sound like a very long-term successful strategy for a society in any manner of means.
And it doesn't mean that you have to start wearing really crazy flamboyant stuff. It doesn't. This is another kind of a false binary, mm-hmm. which is that I have to dress in a way where it looks like I'm terrified that people are going to notice me or they're going to pay attention to me, or I have to dress in a way that I'm desperate for attention, that I have to command every room that I walk into, that everybody has to have all these big expectations of me. And there's nothing wrong with either one of those within the right context. But where most men should be is you dress in a way where you're not desperate for attention, but you're also not uncomfortable with attention and expectations, where you look like you can span that whole spectrum. And so people will notice you when you walk in because it's just like, wow, this guy actually looks put together and he carries himself differently. But what the crap? He's still wearing jeans and a t-shirt and a pair of sneakers like everybody else. And I can't figure out why it looks better. It's that we're after, is we want to wear clothing that makes us look like we are capable of handling pressure and expectations and attention. But our whole identity isn't dependent on people validating us, strangers validating us, because I have to have you pay attention to me and point me out as the big guy in the middle of the room.
Yeah. So what you're saying is really these things are very intricately tied together with who you are and what you wear.
Totally.
And it's something that needs to change together somehow through a longer process. And right. That process can be, like, I think often I work with, like there's a certain value to fake it till you make it. But like, this is where we work a lot with men's groups, where we do, like, we have regular meetings, we have daily buddy calls where you're following up on like a process to be actually building that kind of thing that you're aiming to. We encourage ambitious goals, but then you have to like actually be accountable for following up on those things. And I certainly think that probably clothing and style has been an under prioritized area in what we're doing. This is the first conversation I'm having about it.
Nice.
But do you see any specific cultures in the US? And I know like you're involved with this group around Mariah Mickler, and you have a project together with Jack Donovan, where we're seeing like a resurgence of masculine culture. Do you see some elements there which are helping men to maybe rediscover symbolism or functionality in their dress? Like, as you mentioned, like, 95% of us don't need any functional clothing. It doesn't matter what we're wearing as far as function is concerned. I just bought a farm, so I'm actually really enjoying, like, I wear these like practical, yeah. So I promised my wife I go and do like a half an hour to an hour of farm work every day, right? So I need to have some practical working pants on every day, and it just gives me this sense of identity. Actually, and I fit in with the guys who live here in the local area and stuff like that. But yeah. Other than that, do we need to all move out to the countryside, or if you live in a big city, how can we find in our Western culture, which has just been like, devastated by like this kind of postmodern drive, right?
So I think this is where things are starting to get really interesting, because obviously what you're doing and, the names that you're alluding to as far as like Ryan Mickler, Jack Donovan, all of these other guys, there's a very intentional refocus on masculinity and creating a space for now online, and more organizations or groups are starting to move it offline or do different things, but creating an area where it's like, no, this is not something that we need to apologize for. This is something that we need to actively and intentionally build. I think we're still at the early stages, and this is what happens with any kind of culture or counterculture, is you have kind of this almost like mission statement, or this idea of what it is that you are and what you stand for, that really kind of gets fleshed out. And then from there, it starts to expand into the actual elements that make up a culture. You get your own music, you get your own clothing, you get your own language and jargon, you get your own events, you get your own things like that. And we're starting to see some of these where, you go onto a group like yours, or you go onto different subreddits or different Twitter DM groups, and the language that we use in there is something that the normie is not going to be able to understand. They're not going to know what all these terms are, because we have this kind of like interior language that we understand. And so it's going to be really fun to see when that turns into, you get guys that are pro masculinity that start creating music that celebrates that, or start coming up with an aesthetic and a clothing style that starts to celebrate that. The hard thing about it is it's organic. You can't just have like 4 or 5 guys that are up at the top of the hierarchy and, okay, guys, for this week's call, we're going to figure out what our outfits are going to be, and then we're going to start a whole movement based on this. Or it's like, we're going to create a whole new genre of art, and we're all going to start painting. Like, it happens very organically. And so it's fun to be at the beginning stage of it, but it's also a little bit frustrating because you want to see it. Like, I want to be able to be in some city and see a guy across the street, and based on what he's wearing or the way that his hair is or something else, be able to go, he's one of my guys. Like, he gets it. Because right now it feels like it's this kind of like underground secret culture. And you guys would be surprised how many guys that I have that I work with as clients or initially kind of reach out that may want to work with me, that are in like the upper echelons of major organizations that recognize masculinity is valuable and our current relationship with is it a problem. But everybody has to kind of keep it on the down low. And so it's going to be really fun when our culture picks up enough momentum that you can start to see these outward cultural expressions of it. But I don't know when it's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're kind of like the European alternative to what Ryan Michler's doing, right? And as Europeans, we're all philosophical and we kind of reflect about the existential emptiness of all things and stuff like that. We tend to be slightly more skeptical, I guess, or at least a lot of the guys on here. And so, yeah, you know, I think there's definitely something about like jujitsu, martial arts kind of stuff, which seems to be coming together for a lot of people. But what I really do believe, you said like, okay, like you can't just like invent a whole new genre of art, but at the same time, I think there is the artists and the storytellers. That's where things kind of need to be changing. That's the place where it's going to be right now. You know, our mainstream cultural storytelling is very run by kind of like a mainstream way of a narrative which fits everybody and is driven by a kind of woke paradigm, I guess, right?
And this is what's so pernicious about what postmodernism was able to do, is they made it so that if you were interested in art or in clothing or in anything that was actually core to building a culture, that's not masculine. That's gay. You don't do that. No son of mine is going to go to art school. No son of mine is going to be a tailor, is going to do fashion design or anything, because we created this resistance to it because we bought into the stereotype that somehow that was postmodern, that was effeminate, that was anti-masculine. And so we hamstrung ourselves so that we have to have an entire up and coming generation. You don't have very many Gen X or millennials that are artists or that are musicians or that are into clothing design or anything else like that are also pro masculinity, because their dads beat it out of them. Their culture beat it out of them. And so what our responsibility is to create an environment where that can either reemerge from those generations, or we get younger generations that if they have that proclivity, it's like, good, be an artist and communicate really good, strong components of masculinity with your art or with your music or something else. There's a really good artist, his name's Arthur Kwan Lee, and he's doing a fantastic job of this. And what I love even more than what his art is and how big of a splash he's making is that he's now kind of done the proverbial breaking the 4-minute mile, where it's like, okay, if this guy can do it, then everybody else can start to do it too. And then it starts to open up the floodgates for this stuff.
Okay. The name familiar, Arthur Kwan Lee. I recognize the name. I can't remember, but that'll be interesting because, I mean, so here in Manifesto, we have a lot of the artistic types, actually. We have a lot of guys who are kind of like on this border between technology and arts and culture and poetry and stuff like that as well.
We need you guys.
But what we're lacking sometimes is we have this constant fight with like masculine structure. You know, so like, you know, Ryan Michler runs his outfit in this like super military, like boom, 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 kind of like, you know, get your quarterly plan up by the first of the month, otherwise you're out.
I can't do that. I'm not that way. I'm way more just kind of like as it goes, more in that artistic type too. But again, I think that's one of the problems is you get this kind of look, that worked in the West in the 20th century post-war world, because that's what was necessary in order to be able to survive the two great wars. Like that was necessary. But what a lot of men don't recognize is that, yes, your grandfathers or your great grandfathers or even your fathers, while they had this type of masculinity in spades, they had to sacrifice this type of masculinity on the altar in order to survive the war. And so we had a very one-dimensional version of it. And it doesn't have to be that way. We don't all have to be World War II vets, greatest generation, this type of Spartan, raw warrior. Michelangelo was masculine. Raphael was masculine. There are plenty of men.
The greatest artists that have ever lived have been very masculine.
Right? The best architects, the best chefs, the best artists, the best everything have almost always been men. And so this—
except for mothers, certainly.
Right? Yeah. This idea that we all have to be, and again, this is not to denigrate what Michler does. What Michler does is incredibly necessary. And if that doesn't fit you, then do a different version of it and be more of that chaotic and expressive and expansive and explorative. Do you think that Lewis and Clark would have been able to follow Mickler's regimen the same? Of course not. They're way more just kind of like erratic and exploratory, and that's equally as masculine as being disciplined. And so I think a lot of times we berate ourselves and punish ourselves because we don't, and that doesn't mean that it's all nebulous and you do manhood the way that you do it, you know, where there's no definitions of it, but we get too pigeonholed on what it means, and we need to expand that so that there are lots of ways, and we have cultural evidence of myriad ways to be able to do this other than just the military way of doing it.
Yeah, there's a need for the military guys, and then not all guys are going to fit that mold at all.
Yep.
So Tanner, would you mind sharing a bit with us? What are your personal practices, and you know, especially around kind of relationships, and yeah, if you have like a daily practice of some kind for keeping a masculine focus in your life, but still creating space for an artistic side of yourself?
So this is where, again, I'm very different from Mickler and a lot of the guys. And I've just had to kind of embrace this about myself. I've tried doing a lot of the regimented stuff, the morning routines, doing all this other kind of stuff. And I find for me that it limits my ability to be most effective in what I'm doing. I have to kind of follow my own ebbs and flows. There are a few things that I'm pretty disciplined about. I have a garage gym. I lift every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 o'clock. And part of that is because I have friends in the neighborhood that come over and we do that. I'm pretty
7 in the evening or 7 in the morning?
7 in the morning. 7 in the
Okay.
morning.
Ah,
yeah.
that's
you know,
pretty...
before the kids are up and everything and all that, right? But it's not 5 in the morning.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not quite Jocko Willink
yet. Gurus,
but...
exactly, right? How many gurus are telling me that I'm a baby because I'm not doing it at 5 in the morning, and a real man would do it at 5. Right?
I'm impressed.
7 works,
7 in the morning.
You know?
I'm not up. Yeah. I'm not lifting at 7 in the morning, at least.
Right. Well, and I find that I'm more effective at it if I do it in the morning than I do in the evening. One of the things that I love about what my routine and my schedule look like is that I only work with my clients. I only take calls from between like 11 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, Monday through Thursday. So like Fridays and Saturdays are with my family. I've got 5 kids. And so like Fridays during the winter, we just finished our last season. I take my kids skiing every Friday. And in the summer, we go to the pool every Friday. And like, that is very focused, consecrated family time. Same thing with Sundays. I'm religious. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so Sundays are a Sabbath. I don't turn my phones on. I don't do any social media. We have Sunday be a very special day. Those are the few things that are relatively regimented. And then other than that, it's just, where am I? You know, what do I want to work on? Like right now, I'm planning a big live event for some of my clients that we're doing a 2-day thing that involves lifting and style coaching. And I haven't done that before. And part of it is because that's been a bug in my ear for the last few months, that it's like, okay, I'm going to chase this and I'm going to pursue it. Or maybe it'll be working on this or working on that. And I find that if I can give myself enough space to ebb and flow with where things are supposed to be, then that's when I can produce my best stuff. That's when I can create the best content. That's when I can create the best stuff for clients. That's when I can give my family the best attention, as opposed to, I got to have my battle plan and I have to know something regimented every hour on the hour. For me, that's never worked. I felt claustrophobic and trapped by that stuff instead.
Yeah. But certainly having some form of masculine fellowship or group of guys that you have regular contact with, I guess for you, this group of guys you lift with, like just that, for me, that gives that grounding. And then exactly, you know, there can be many different cultures and many different ways of being with that group of guys, but having that gives me a grounding. And then I wonder if I can get you to talk about the other aspect you mentioned a little bit about, and that's family and the relationship with your wife, the relationship with your kids. Do you have any principles or kind of, ways of being that you found has really helped you to keep a masculine role in your family and be the father and be the husband?
This is kind of hard right now, because one of the things that I've learned just recently, so our 5th is a year old, and there's something about having more kids that when you introduce your first child, or maybe it's your 3rd child, and again at your 5th child, like whatever system worked before just kind of breaks and doesn't work anymore. And you can almost think about it like with a vehicle, where if it's me and my wife, like when we were first married, we love to just go ride on the motorcycle. And we can't do that when you have a first child. Like the two of us can when we go on a date night, but it's not like if we're going to go do something, we're just going to load the baby up in between us on the, like, it doesn't work. You have to have a different vehicle. And then same thing when you get to your fourth kid, all of a sudden it's like, okay, we got to do an SUV or a minivan or something else because we can't physically fit the kids in. And it's a really good metaphor for the fact that things like the systems kind of break down, or what worked before doesn't work here. And to be honest, we haven't figured out the system yet that works with having this fifth kid. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting for both me and my wife this last year is the recognition of how much of our own personal development and our growth was really kind of, I don't want to say hiding, but almost like procrastinating, working on the real kind of like core deep issues that we have. And you build this system that kind of can circumvent it and work around it. And so one of the things that I've been learning fairly recently is my responsibility as a father is, one, to shore up all the good things that my parents and their parents and their parents did. Two, it's to break the cycle of all the negative things that my parents and their parents and their parents did. And it's amazing to see how intergenerationally that gets passed down. I hate seeing the way that my parents screwed up, and just because they're fallible, they're normal humans, like they had the best intentions and they screwed up. And it messed me up because I was a kid, and when you have imperfect parents, it messes you up. And then I hate to see how I'm perpetuating that with my own children. So I feel this massive weight of responsibility to break that so that my kids don't have to deal with all the stuff that I did, or that my parents did, or that their parents did. And then what I think that leads to even more, number three, is I hate the trope that fatherhood is just complacency, like the dopey dad that just wants to go to work and he just wants to come home, and it's like, I don't have time to be in good shape, or I don't have time to focus on this, or I don't have time to do that because I'm just so tired because of my work, and so I'm just gonna check out. It's wicked. Like it's so immoral to not feel this burden of responsibility to continue to work on yourself and develop yourself, to take your talents and the things that you're good at and shore them up, but then at the same time take the things that you suck at and get better at those, and be willing to confront those things that you hate about yourself, that you're scared of about yourself, that you never want to admit to anybody, even yourself, that you're weak in that arena, and say, stop being a pussy and just admit that that's how you're broken, or that's how you're screwed up, and start to fix that and address that, because otherwise you're going to screw up your kids. You're going to mess up your relationship with your wife. And so the burden of fatherhood and the blessing of fatherhood is the responsibility to constantly grow every month, every year, all the time, because until you've arrived at some level of godhood, then you're not done growing. You still have things that you have to fix, and it's your responsibility to do that, and then set the tenor within your family that this is who we are. For us, this is what Guzzies do, is we grow, we do hard things, we fix things, we continue to improve. That's the culture that I want to establish for my kids. And I think as men, that's our responsibility to lead out on that.
Yeah, good and challenging words. Thanks for that. So yeah, I'm going to ask another question, then I'm going to open up for questions from the participants as well. So guys, if you have something, then you can put up your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to call someone out. But yeah, I really liked it. You said this is what Guzzies do, because I think, the first thing that you can influence and change as a father is yourself. And that's where your primary focus is going to be. But I also think that, if I have to say, well, what kind of trope do I hate about fatherhood and masculinity? That's the one that it's the father who is only responsible for himself and doesn't take responsibility for the family. Because at the end of the day, like, that's your primary job, is to be the captain, the CEO, the guide, the navigator, the one who can see the dangers ahead and protect and provide as well. Like you need to be able to take a form of leadership for your family. It doesn't mean you have to dominate or anything like that, but it does mean you need to develop your own ability to trust in yourself as a man, and to dare to you know, even when your wife, you know, you have to listen to everything your wife says, so she often has a better intuition than you. But then you need to be able to say, well, you know, I'm basing my decision on my best understanding of the situation and what's going to be good for us, instead of just like, you know, delegating the, you know, giving it over. Like, well, I'm going to avoid the responsibility by letting my wife decide.
The wife. Yeah.
And then it's like that. If everything crashes, then I can say, oh, it wasn't my fault, you know, kind of thing, right? Yep. So actually daring to take that leadership. So part of what I just had a good discussion with one of our groups on core last evening, was about, as a man, developing a system for the development of yourself and your family together with your wife, and how to make sure, like you spoke about, like, you know, not going directly at the most difficult tasks. And I think part of it is, like, you know, as you said, like the systems break down. Being in a relationship with another person, it's a constant, like, needing to go to the next level, going to the next one. It never finishes. So you need a way of being able to address that as well, and making sure that you're moving as a family, as a unit, and you know, not forcing, not tyrannically oppressing, but integrating what people
and leading out from the front. Yeah.
Good. Richard, you welcome. Let's have your question.
Thank you, and super nice to listen to you, Tanner. Really Thanks, inspiring, Richard. Man.
Thanks. Man.
I have a question around. I'd love to hear you talk about style itself. Like, I'm curious as to how you might relate it to how men aren't showing up with regards to, say, responsibility, sharpness, presence. Like, do these things have a relationship to style to you?
Yeah, 100%. And again, this is why it's so crucial to start with. One of the fascinating things about what I do with my clients is, yes, by the time we're done working together, you have a great wardrobe and you look aesthetically good. But even more importantly is, as we go through the process, we uncover what your identity is and what your aspirational identity is, because that's what you really have to work with in order to create good, congruent, effective style. And so, do you want to communicate things like credibility, authority, trustworthiness? Is it openness and friendliness and affability? Is it all of those things? And what does that look like for you guys, being in the part of the world that you are and working in the industries in which you work and having the family relationships that you have? It's very different than it is for me with my components. And so you have to have a really integrated understanding of who you are, what your moral background and backbone are, how that gets translated over into other people, and then how you can use your clothing to express it to them and reinforce it in yourself. And so, yeah, if you're not disciplined and you want to be more disciplined, then maybe we add a little bit more of this aesthetic version of discipline in your clothing, not to like fake it till you make it, because then you feel really like disingenuous in what you're wearing. But you can almost think about it from like a progressive overload from a strength training perspective, where we just add like 5 pounds more, and then 5 pounds more, and then 5 pounds more. So we do this next iteration of your wardrobe that just looks a little bit more disciplined and put together. And then we tweak it a little bit more and it gets a little bit more disciplined and put together, because a lot of times what you want is that dissonance, that discomfort, that tension is a really good thing if you allow it to pull you up to what you're projecting to be, as opposed to, I'm going to live in this duplicity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was thinking of general themes, but what you've explained and actually makes more sense is that it really depends on the man and what he needs and where he's at, basically. So that his clothing is going to be a reflection of that, if I understand you right.
Totally. And I mean, think about it. Like, I've got a client right now that he runs a roofing business in Wisconsin, and another one who is a bank manager in Boise, Idaho, in this small like intermountain town in Idaho. And then another one who owns this like high-end car detailing company that they work on multi-million-dollar cars. And most of these guys, all three of these guys, they want to communicate the same things, but they're so different in how that's expressed. It's the same thing with, how many of you guys speak other languages? Just give me a raising hand, right?
We all
okay,
do, yeah.
I figured you all do, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with me. I learned to speak Spanish. The idea of, okay, take love, for example. Love in English is really hard to be able to articulate because we've got one word for it. And so you have to not only learn what that word is, but then you have to learn all of these other little like workarounds to try and explain it, because the love for my wife is different than the love for my kids, which is different than the love that I have for the brotherhood of men that I've got. And that doesn't mean that any one of these are any different types of love, but I have to kind of work around it because of what the limitations are. Whereas when you speak a different language, like in Greek, you've got like eros and phratos and agape, and you've got all these different terms that you can use for the same thing. Clothing is like language. You may be in a culture where your clothing has one specific thing. Like you look at the West in the 20th century, and dignity and authority and credibility meant the suit, but we're not in that world anymore. And so how do you speak your aesthetic language with people that speak that aesthetic language, so you can communicate dignity and authority and credibility the same way that we have to have our workarounds to be able to try and express a term like love in our different languages?
Good. Thanks, Richard. And I'm going to now stop the recording and we're going to go into a more private conversation. So normally we go a level deeper when we do that, so we don't have to worry. And then I think I'm going to ask perhaps the most stylish man on Core, I would say, is Daniel Karawasa. If you're going to give us your reflections to continue the conversation.